Hello, Team 613. This is Mr. Get, and I wanted to give you a little bit of an update with how we're doing with our robot. As you know, there are a couple of projects we've been working on. The one we were working on last Saturday, that was February 1st, and that we've been working on for the last week, has been our catapult loading system. As you know, we're going to use a catapult um, to fire the ball into the goal. We've done some tests to show that a catapult can get the ball up to into our goal, and it can do it somewhat consistently. This is a catapult that we built using 80-20 pieces and using springs that we can stretch back and load and then release the catapult, and the ball is gone into the goal. One thing we discovered was that we have to be careful about where we put the ball. We have to on the catapult. There can't be any sharp edges because we did pop our game piece using that. So that's something that we did learn, which is a good lesson. But when it comes to a catapult launching system, there are really three parts to it, right? There's the spring-loaded catapult itself, so that's the kind of the firing system to it or subsystem to it that pulls it, that we've done some experiments with, and we learned that we want to use a spring with it. We want to we're going to have it rotate around a pivot point right about here. We know about how long we want it to go, and we know that this kind of releases the ball the way we want it to. So that's the first system, and we have some good information about that. Now here's a little animation, right, of what our ball does. We do need to work about how we're going to get the ball onto the catapult, but this part of the system is pretty good. Now, the second two parts of a catapult system are the way that you load it. Sometimes that's called cocking a catapult, like when you cock a gun. So we have to figure out a way to load it now. So loading is not putting the ball into it; it's basically pulling the catapult back so that you've added a lot of spring energy to it. I guess the third part of a catapult system is the release mechanism. You want a release mechanism that will cleanly release the catapult consistently so that you'll always get a consistent shot. And these last two parts are what we've been working on trying to design. Kunal, who was visiting us for the first 2 weeks on break from college, had come up with a system that kind of integrated both the cocking of the catapult and also the releasing of the catapult into one unit. He thought that could solve the whole thing, which is this cam, is what he called it. A cam is just it's kind of a shape, an oval shape or some kind of funky shape that you twist, that you put rotational motion onto it. And one thing that a cam can do is it can turn that rotational motion into linear motion. And so Kunal's idea was, well, if we have this funky shaped cam, we actually had one from a robot 5 years ago, the soccer robot. He took that one and said, if we just put it at the right point on the catapult, and we attach it to a motor and get it to spin, what it's going to do is load or cock the catapult for us. And then it also, when it turns to the right point, the catapult will be allowed to slip, and that's going to release it, and it's going to fire suddenly. And so if you notice, the cam here turns, okay, and it turns to a point where it has pulled the catapult all the way back, and then it turns a little bit more. The ball is in the catapult now, and it can slip closed. The catapult can be released. So it's a good idea in theory, and I'm sure it would work if we had if we had a lot of time to really design the shape of the cam right. However, what we found when we did this was that you have to load you have to cock the entire catapult in less than one turn of the cam when you think about the shape of it. So you do have to have quite a bit of power in the single available, because one turn of the cam has to be able to cock the entire catapult, and these springs are pretty tight. The other thing was that it was so kind of herky-jerky and vibrating so much that there's no way we were going to get a consistent shot with the design that we had. And so it was a good idea in theory, but it looks like integrating the two methods of cocking and releasing into a single system probably isn't going to work. There are some downsides to it, but the cam was a good was a good first attempt for the club. Now, a second idea that you all have come up with, and the idea that we're exploring now, is a winch and release system. So in this case, what a winch is basically, it's like a motorized pulley that a cord wraps around. And what you do is, so we have our cord that's attached to the back of the that's attached to the winch. We turn the motor on, and it's going to spin this big spindle or pulley, and it's going to wrap the cord up, and it's going to gradually cock the catapult. So there's a little kind of a little animation there of it being cocked up. So we've stretched our catapult, and now what we would like to do is have a system to release it. So that's our third system. So how do we release it with a winch system? Well, and there are a couple of ideas that I can think about, but you all have suggested a very good idea, which is to have something called a clutch on the winch system. And what the clutch does is it detaches the spindle from the motor. If we suddenly detach our motor from our spindle from the motor, the spindle can now spin freely, and it's just going to release the catapult. Right. So if we suddenly release the spindle from the motor, the spindle is just going to spin freely, and it's going to release it from the and it's going to effectively release the catapult. And so the spindle's going to unwind. It's going to let the cable out, or the cable out, and the catapult is going to snap closed. Okay, and so this is one solution for our cocking system and our releasing system, is we have this winch with a clutch built into it. And we played around with how can you add the clutch. You all looked online, and you can actually buy clutches from companies. But the essential idea of a clutch is that if you have a motor right here that's turning an axle, and then you have the spindle right here that's turning, you want to somehow kind of break the connection between the motor and the spindle, so that when you want to, the connection is joined, so that the spindle gets turned when the motor turns. But then when you break the connection between the two, the spindle will turn freely. And the question is, well, how do you do that so you can have it either powered or unpowdered? Here we have an example of a basic clutch mechanism. The clutches that you'll find in cars and in other devices are different. There's many different varieties of clutches that all have their pluses and minuses, but here's a basic clutch mechanism that communicates what the basic parts of a clutch are. So a clutch will have something called a driving shaft, which is generally connected to your motor. You will have something called a driven shaft, which is connected to whatever needs to get power from the motor. And then you'll have two states of a clutch. You'll have a disengaged state, and when it's disengaged, energy or power cannot be transferred from the driving shaft to the driven shaft. And when you have the engaged state, the two are touching each other, and your energy can be transferred from your driving shaft to your driven shaft. So, for example, when you're in a car, there's a pedal called a clutch. If you're in a car with a mechanical transmission or manual transmission, there is a pedal you can press called the clutch. And when you press it, it disengages the motors from the rest of the transmission, or the engine from the rest of the transmission. And so it would look similar to this. Now, they don't use this type of clutch in a car, but it is in a disengaged state. And so your driving shaft, your engine, is no longer supplying energy to the wheels, and so your car will gradually slow down if you push on the clutch pedal. However, if you release the clutch pedal, the two pieces become engaged again, and power can be transferred from your driving shaft to your driven shaft. Now, this is called a cone clutch because if you notice, the driven part of the shaft is connected to this device that looks a little bit like it has kind of a cone shape to it. And it's this cone shape that attaches to this kind of receptacle that's attached to the driven shaft. And These two surfaces, because of friction, will cause, since this one's turning, the friction force exerted from this onto this is going to cause this cone to turn, which then transfers power to the driven shaft. So this is actually called a friction clutch because it uses the friction between these two pieces to transfer the power from this piece to this piece right here. That happens when we're in the engaged state. There are other different types of clutches. However, what we're going to do is we're going to make this spindle have two different positions along the shaft, position A and position B. All right, and it can move between position A and position B. Now, if you were to look at our axle, this axle is not a cylindrical axle. It's actually if you were to do a cross section of it, it's actually an octagon. It's actually it's a slightly different shape than an octagon, but it's called a hex. So I guess it would be 6-sided, and I made it 8-sided, but it's good enough for this presentation. So it's got this weird shape to it, and then what we have on our spindle, which this is the end of the spindle, is we have a special cutout that's in the shape of a hex as well. And so when the hex shaft turns, if you look at the geometry closely, it's going to push on the cutout part of the spindle and cause the spindle to turn. Okay, so when we push this spindle over to position B, we've changed the axle, so it's no longer a hex axle. It's now a cylindrical axle, a circle. And when we turn this, it's no longer going to turn the spindle with it. And so this is the part where the two are not connected. So tell me, when we're at position A, which shaft is the driving shaft? Is it this one that's connected to the motor, or is it the spindle? Okay, well, our driving shaft is the one that's connected to the motor, so it's this one. And this is our driven shaft. It's being turned by the driving shaft. And in this case, the two are engaged because when the driving shaft turns, it's turning the driven shaft. When we slip it over to position B, our driving shaft is no longer coupled, is no longer going to cause the driven shaft to turn with it because it's circular, and it can turn freely inside this cutout without causing the spindle to turn as well. So this is the idea for our winch, our releasing mechanism. So we're working on building it. We obviously need something that can push the spindle back and forth, and we have a pneumatic system that we're going to do that with to push it back and forth between position A and position B, so that we can engage and disengage our winch from the motor. Okay, so what have we learned today? Well, we learned that there are 3 parts to a catapult system. There's the actual catapult part, but then just as important, there's the loading part, and then there's the releasing mechanism that will consistently release it. We know that we had one design idea that was proposed by Kunal and we all worked on with the cam, where we combined both the releasing and the cocking or loading parts into a single device that we wanted to accomplish both of them, and it worked, but it was so inconsistent, and it vibrated, and it was so crazy that we don't think it would be a great solution for what we're looking at unless we put a lot more work into it. And so we've come up with a second idea for a cocking mechanism, which is our winch, and then a way to release the catapult system, which is to add this clutch into our winching mechanism that will cause it to turn freely. Okay, so that's what we've been working on, and hopefully I'll have some pictures of the device soon. Okay, bye.